The loudest celebration my ex-wife's family ever threw wasn't for a wedding. It was for my divorce.
On a Friday evening in late October, while I was sitting alone in a Charlotte apartment learning how to cook for one, her family gathered at a restaurant in South Park, ordered a three-course meal, and toasted the end of our marriage with the particular enthusiasm of people who believed they had narrowly avoided a catastrophe. I found out later through a mutual friend who felt guilty saying nothing. Apparently someone made a speech. My name is Damon Pritchard. I am 41 years old. I have made significant mistakes in my life, and I have built something significant from nothing, and I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that those two facts can both be true about the same person at the same time. The company was called Cornerstone Freight Solutions. It was headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was by almost every external measure invisible. Not failing. Not struggling. Not coasting. Invisible. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Cornerstone didn't move furniture. We didn't deliver packages. We didn't operate a fleet of branded trucks that people recognized from highway billboards. What we did was harder to explain and considerably more valuable. We designed and managed the complete logistical infrastructure for mid-sized manufacturers across the Southeast. Companies that built industrial components, commercial kitchen equipment, construction materials, specialty textiles. Companies that understood their products completely and their supply chains barely at all. They were hemorrhaging money on freight costs they couldn't evaluate because they lacked the expertise to know what reasonable looked like. They were signing carrier contracts that served the carrier's interests exclusively. They were routing shipments inefficiently, warehousing inventory expensively, and absorbing compliance penalties for regulations they hadn't known existed until the invoice arrived. We fixed that. Not by selling them software. Not by offering a consulting report they could shelve beside other consulting reports. We embedded ourselves inside their operations, rebuilt their freight relationships from the foundation, and charged a percentage of documented savings. If we didn't save them money, we didn't get paid. That model required absolute confidence in the work. It also built a particular kind of client loyalty that no marketing budget could replicate. When the savings were real and consistent and verifiable, clients didn't leave. They sent their industry contacts to us instead. That was our entire growth strategy. Results, then reputation, then referrals. In that order always. Nobody wrote magazine profiles about freight logistics optimization. Nobody invited supply chain consultants onto morning television. The industry existed in the background of the economy, making everything else function more efficiently, while remaining almost entirely uncelebrated. I didn't build it for celebration. I built it because I was good at it, and because being good at something useful felt like enough of a reason. That belief, I would eventually learn, was precisely what Vivian's family could never forgive. 9 years before their celebration dinner, Cornerstone Freight Solutions occupied a single room inside a shared office building on the east side of Charlotte. One desk. One laptop. One filing cabinet I had purchased secondhand from a law firm that was downsizing. The chair squeaked when I leaned back, which I discovered on the first day and never fully resolved. My first client was a cabinet manufacturer in Gastonia, paying nearly 40% above market rate on monthly freight costs. Not because they were careless. Because nobody had ever shown them a different number and explained how to reach it. After we restructured their carrier contracts and rebuilt their routing approach, they saved $190,000 in the first 12 months. They sent me 2 referrals within the year. Those referrals sent others. I didn't celebrate the Gastonia contract. I didn't take anyone to dinner. I drove back to Charlotte in a used Silverado, stopped at a gas station for a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime the previous afternoon, and spent the evening drafting the operational framework that would eventually become the methodology we sold 9 years later. Those early years built something in me that prosperity never could have built alone. I learned what it felt like to believe in something before it gave you any reasonable evidence that belief was justified. I learned the specific discipline of continuing to work carefully when nobody was watching, when no external validation existed, when the only confirmation that you were on the right path was the quality of the work itself. I learned that the most reliable foundation for anything is the part nobody sees being constructed. By the time I met Vivian, Cornerstone had grown into something real. 3 offices, 60 plus manufacturés clients, a team of logistics coordinators, compliance specialists, and carrier relationship managers who were genuinely excellent at what they did. Revenue that had grown every consecutive year without exception. I was 34. I still drove the Silverado. I still arrived before most of my staff. I still ate lunch in the break room with the operations team more often than in my office, because the conversations that happened over reheated food and bad coffee told me more about the company's actual health than any report my executive team could have produced. Vivian and I met at a mutual friend's birthday gathering in Noda. She was warm, honest, and genuinely funny in the specific way that cannot be performed. She laughed at things that were actually funny and remained unimpressed by things that were merely expensive, which I found immediately attractive. On our 3rd date, she asked what I did. I explained Cornerstone as plainly as I could. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. Then she said, "So you fix something invisible that's costing them real money, and you only get paid if the fix is real?" "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." She nodded. "That seems like the honest way to do it." I decided then that I intended to marry her. What I hadn't yet understood was that the woman I was falling in love with and the family she came from had developed 2 entirely separate value systems, and that eventually those systems would compete for the same territory. I want to be precise about Vivian's family, because imprecision would be unfair to them. They were not cruel people. They were not shallow people in the simple sense of that word. Her father, Roosevelt, had built a successful commercial real estate portfolio over 30 years through genuine hard work and strategic thinking. Her mother, Loretta, had raised 4 children while managing the administrative operations of her husband's business with a competence that nobody adequately acknowledged. Her brother Calvin was sharp and ambitious in ways that would eventually serve him well. They loved Vivian completely. They loved my daughter Imani with a warmth that was entirely real. Their failure was not a failure of character. It was a failure of imagination. They had constructed a very precise picture of what success looked like from the outside, and they had spent decades reinforcing that picture for one another, and they had arrived at the settled conviction that anything which didn't resemble that picture was probably not success at all. A freight logistics company with no recognizable name, no branded vehicles on the highway, no industry awards displayed in a lobby, no profile in Charlotte Business Journal, and a founder who drove a used pickup truck and wore suits that were good but not notable, didn't resemble their picture. And so they decided, quietly at first and then with increasing confidence, that I was a man who had found a comfortable ceiling and chosen to call it ambition. They were not trying to be wrong. They simply were. The first time I understood the shape of the problem, we were at Roosevelt and Loretta's home in Ballantyne for Sunday dinner. Calvin had recently closed on a condominium in South End. The conversation at the table circled it for nearly 20 minutes. Square footage, building amenities, projected appreciation, comparable sales. Roosevelt beamed with the specific pride of a man watching his values successfully transmitted to the next generation. Then Loretta looked toward me with genuine goodwill in her expression. "Damon, when are you and Vivian going to find something? You've been renting long enough." "We're looking," I said. "Taking our time." Roosevelt nodded slowly. "What's your price range?" I gave him a number. He received it with a neutral expression that communicated, without words, that the number was acceptable, but not impressive. Then he said, "You know what you ought to consider," and proceeded to spend several minutes explaining why I should exit freight logistics and pursue commercial real estate instead. Not as a suggestion. As a correction. Vivian was quiet beside me throughout this exchange. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Familiar. The way people become familiar with a conversation that recurs often enough to lose its sharp edges. On the drive home she said, "He means well." "I know," I said. A pause. "He just doesn't understand what you do." "Most people don't," I said. She looked out the passenger window at the Charlotte suburbs moving past. "Does that bother you?" I thought about it honestly before answering. "Not anymore," I said. She nodded slowly. "Good." But I noticed she hadn't answered whether it bothered her. Here is the thing about a marriage ending that nobody prepares you for. It rarely ends in a single dramatic moment. It rarely ends in a betrayal or a confrontation or a door slammed with enough force to settle everything. Those endings exist, but they're not the most common kind. The most common kind is quieter and more confusing and considerably harder to address, because you cannot point to the thing that broke when the thing that broke is a slow accumulation of small divergences, each one individually survivable, collectively fatal. Vivian never stopped loving me. I am confident of that, even now. What happened was that the people she loved most had spent years constructing a case against my version of ambition, and she had spent years partially defending me and partially absorbing their framework, and eventually the two positions became impossible to hold simultaneously. She had to choose which story to believe. She chose theirs. Not because she was weak, because she was tired and their story was louder. And mine had always been too quiet to compete on volume alone. The evening she told me, Imani was already asleep. Vivian sat across from me in the living room with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression I recognized as the particular look of someone who has been rehearsing a difficult conversation long enough that the emotion and the words have partially separated from each other. She was honest. I will always respect that she was honest. She said she loved me. She said she believed I was a good man, perhaps the most genuinely good man she had known, and she wanted me to understand that she meant that without qualification. Then she said she had spent 4 years waiting to feel proud in the specific way she had imagined feeling proud, and she wasn't sure that feeling was coming, and she wasn't sure anymore that waiting for it was fair to either of us. I asked her what pride looked like to her. She was quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "I think I wanted people to look at our life and understand immediately that you had built something." I said gently, "People who understand business know exactly what we've built." She said, "I know. But I wanted it to be visible without explanation." I sat with that for a while. Then I said the truest thing I knew. The work I do doesn't announce itself. That's not a flaw in the work. It's just the nature of it. I can't change that and keep doing it well. And I don't want to do something else to satisfy an audience that isn't paying attention to begin with. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. "I know," she said. "I know that about you. I've always known that." And somehow the fact that she knew it, and it still wasn't enough, was the saddest part of the entire conversation. We sat in that living room for another hour without resolving anything, because there was nothing left to resolve. The decision had already been made somewhere in the preceding months. We were simply completing the paperwork of acknowledging it. What Vivian didn't know, what I was legally bound from telling her or anyone else, was that Cornerstone Freight Solutions was in the final stages of an acquisition negotiation that would change the material circumstances of my life permanently. 14 months earlier, I had been approached through an intermediary by one of the largest national supply chain corporations in the country. They had spent years building their Southeast regional consulting presence through acquisitions rather than organic growth, and someone inside their strategy division had been studying our client retention rates, our documented savings percentages, and the methodology we use for carrier contract negotiation. They wanted to buy not just the company, but the operating system we had built inside it. The lead attorney on their side was direct from the beginning. Confidentiality is absolute and non-negotiable. No disclosure to employees, partners, investors, or family members. Any breach terminates the agreement immediately and exposes all parties to significant liability. I signed. I signed because the opportunity was legitimate and transformational, and because protecting the process meant protecting 300 people whose livelihoods depended on the company remaining stable through the negotiation period. And every evening for 14 months, I drove home carrying the largest secret of my life, set it down at the door, and walked inside as though nothing beneath the surface of our lives was moving. The silence Vivian interpreted as complacency was actually discipline. She never knew the difference. By the time she might have, she had already decided she had waited long enough. The divorce finalized on a Wednesday morning. The judge was professional and thorough, and wished us both well in a tone that suggested he had said those words enough times to mean them genuinely despite the repetition. We thanked him. We walked outside into a Charlotte morning that was unremarkable in every meteorological respect, and felt like the last page of something I hadn't finished reading. Imani was with us. She was 7 years old and had been told, in the careful language parents use with children when adult situations exceed what children should carry. That things were changing but that both her parents loved her completely, and that some things stay the same no matter what else moves. She had accepted this with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old, who understands more than she's letting on. In the parking lot, I knelt down to her level. She looked at me for a moment before saying, "You're still going to come to my school thing on Thursday?" "Yes," I said. "I'll be there early." She considered this. "And you'll bring the good snacks? Not the ones from the gas station." I laughed so completely and suddenly that I startled a woman walking past us toward the courthouse entrance. I said I would bring the good snacks. She nodded, satisfied, and hugged me with both arms around my neck. Then she walked with her mother toward their car. I stood in that parking lot long after they had gone, in the particular stillness of a man who has just experienced the simultaneous end and continuation of the most important thing in his life. That evening, across Charlotte, Vivian's family gathered for what they described as a celebratory dinner. I heard about it the same way I heard the first time. A mutual friend who felt the silence of saying nothing was its own kind of betrayal. Roosevelt gave a toast. Loretta wore something she had purchased specifically for the occasion. Calvin brought a bottle of something expensive. Someone made a joke about warehouses and used trucks that landed well enough to generate laughter that carried out to the sidewalk. They were not celebrating maliciously. They were celebrating the story they had always told about me, which was now confirmed in their reading by the fact that I was gone. The story was wrong, but I had no interest in arguing with it that evening. I was alone in my apartment, eating reheated food, reviewing a document my attorney had sent over, because the acquisition was entering its penultimate stage, and the timeline was not adjustable for anyone's personal calendar. The phone call arrived on a Tuesday. I was at the office early, which was not unusual, walking the floor before the rest of the team arrived, which was also not unusual, drinking bad coffee from the break room, which had been my consistent choice for 9 years regardless of what my bank account suggested I could afford instead. My attorney called at 8:22 in the morning. He said the board had completed its review. He said the vote had been unanimous. He said the acquisition of Cornerstone Freight Solutions had officially closed, and then he told me the number. And I sat down in the break room chair that had always squeaked slightly, in the room that smelled like someone's reheated lunch and coffee that had been sitting too long. And I didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He waited. Finally I said, "Thank you." He laughed warmly. "Congratulations, Damon. You built something real." I sat there after the call ended and thought about the Gastonia cabinet manufacturer and their $190,000 in first-year savings. I thought about the squeaking chair in my first office. I thought about the gas station coffee on the drive back from that first client meeting. I thought about Imani telling me to bring the good snacks. Then I made 5 calls before I told another person. Tax attorney, certified financial planner, estate and trust lawyer, private wealth advisor, security consultant specializing in privacy protection for individuals who preferred their financial circumstances to remain their own business. Because the same discipline that built the company was now responsible for protecting what the company had produced. Nothing about my judgment was changing because a number had changed. I want to be honest about the car. 6 months after the acquisition closed, I bought a Porsche 911 Turbo S in gentian blue metallic. I want to be honest about why, because the easy version of this story would frame it as a symbol, a statement, an arrival. The moment the quiet man finally announced himself. That's not why. I bought it because when I was 13 years old, growing up on the west side of Charlotte, my uncle had taken me to an auto show at the convention center downtown. I had stood in front of a Porsche display for 20 minutes while he waited nearby with the patience of a man who understood that some moments in a child's life deserve to be unrushed. On the way home, I told him that one day I was going to own one. He said, "I believe you." He died of a heart attack 4 years later at 51 years old. Before Cornerstone existed, before any of this was real. I bought the car because I had told him I would. Because some promises are made to people who are no longer present to watch them kept, and keeping them anyway is the only form of conversation still available. That was the reason. Anyone who needed a different reason was constructing a story about me that I wasn't responsible for correcting. The afternoon I drove through South Park was not planned. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story that feels most satisfying would have me orchestrating a deliberate reveal with cinematic precision, timing the route, selecting the location, arriving exactly when I knew they would be present. That's not what happened. I was driving because it was a Saturday and the weather was the specific kind of Charlotte autumn afternoon that makes sitting indoors feel like a waste of something finite. And I had no particular destination. And the car was genuinely excellent to drive. And sometimes that's the entire reason. I slowed near the restaurant because traffic ahead had paused. I saw Roosevelt first. He was standing near the entrance with a drink in his hand, mid-conversation, relaxed, occupying the particular posture of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings. Then he turned toward the street. I watched his face process what he was seeing in real time. The car. The driver. The car again. The driver again. Vivian was standing slightly behind him. She turned a moment after he did. The valet materialized beside my window with the careful expression of someone managing a situation he hadn't been trained for specifically. I pulled to the curb and stepped out. The afternoon was very quiet for a moment. Roosevelt set his drink on the nearest surface, which I believe was a planter near the entrance, without looking away from me. He walked forward with the deliberate movement of a man who has decided to confront something he doesn't yet understand. He said, "Damon." I said, "Roosevelt." He looked at the car. Back at me. At the car again. "Is this yours?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said carefully, "Where does this come from?" "The same place it always came from," I said. "The work." "Freight logistics," he said. His voice was not contemptuous. It was genuinely bewildered, which was somehow more interesting. "Yes." He shook his head slowly. Not in dismissal. In genuine recalibration. He said, "Damon, someone bought the company." It wasn't a question either. "Yes." He looked at Vivian. Then back at me. "When?" "A few months after the divorce finalized." Silence. He said, "You knew during the marriage." I said, "I knew negotiations were in progress. I was legally prohibited from disclosing them to anyone. That prohibition was a condition of the entire process, not an option." He absorbed this. Then he said something I had not expected from Roosevelt. Not because he was incapable of it, but because I had never witnessed him practice it. He said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. He said, "I spent 4 years measuring your life against a standard I built from things I could see and understand. I decided that what I couldn't see probably wasn't worth seeing." He paused, and I could tell the pause was genuine rather than performed. "I dismissed your work because I didn't understand it, and I convinced people I love to see you through that dismissal. That was wrong. It was arrogant and it was wrong, and I'm telling you that plainly." He extended his hand. I shook it. Not because everything was resolved. Not because an apology reconstructs what it addresses. But because a man admitting he was wrong in front of his family, genuinely and without qualification, is not a small thing. And I was not going to diminish it by withholding acknowledgement. I said, "I appreciate that, Roosevelt. I mean it." He nodded. Loretta placed her hand on his arm and said nothing. Calvin looked at the sidewalk. Then Vivian walked toward me. She stopped a few feet away. She looked at me with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. I thought about it honestly before answering, because she deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. I said, "I'm getting there." She nodded slowly. Then from inside the restaurant, moving at the velocity she applied to everything, came Imani. She had apparently been watching through the window with the focused attention of someone monitoring a situation she considered her personal concern. She hit my legs at full speed, grabbed both my hands, looked up at me with complete certainty, and said, "I knew that was your car. I saw it from the window. It's the right color." I picked her up. She was getting heavier in the particular way that children get heavier when you're not with them every day and the change accumulates in your absence. I held on longer than I needed to. She said into my shoulder, "Can I sit in the front seat?" I looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at her daughter. At me. At the afternoon around us, which had become something none of us had expected when we woke up that morning. She said, "Yes, baby. Go ahead. I want to tell you about the part of this story that doesn't get told. It's not the car. It's not the acquisition number. It's not Roosevelt's apology or the afternoon in South Park. It's the Thursday school event 3 weeks after the divorce finalized, when I arrived before any other parent because I had promised I would be early, and I sat in a small chair designed for a 7-year-old and watched my daughter perform a 2-minute speaking part in her class's history presentation. Her part lasted 120 seconds. I had driven 40 minutes to be there. She looked at me once from the front of the classroom, mid-sentence, and didn't lose her place. Afterward, she found me near the door and said, "You came." I said, "I told you I would." She said, "I know. I just wanted to make sure." That moment is the foundation that no acquisition changes and no celebration touches and no divorce reaches. I have built several things in my life that I'm proud of. That is the one I would rebuild first if everything else disappeared. About a year after the acquisition closed, I spoke at an entrepreneurship summit in Raleigh. After the panel, a woman named Adrienne approached me near the back of the conference hall. She didn't ask about the company. She didn't mention that she'd looked me up. She asked what I had gotten wrong during the early years, because she said she had noticed that most founders talked about what they'd gotten right, and she was tired of that particular version of the conversation. I thought about it. I said, I assumed that if the work was real, the people I loved would be able to see it without me explaining it. I thought the results would speak clearly enough. But results speak in a language that requires fluency to understand, and I never taught anyone close to me how to read it. That was my failure, not theirs. She nodded. She said, "That's the most honest answer I've heard all day." We talked for nearly 2 hours. She had built and sold a healthcare technology company in her early 30s, and was currently running a nonprofit that placed business mentors inside underserved communities across North Carolina. She was direct without being aggressive. She laughed at things that were genuinely funny. She remained unimpressed by things that were merely expensive. I recognized something in that combination. 3 months later, we were still talking. 6 months later, I told her about my uncle and the auto show and the Porsche and the promise I had kept to someone who wasn't there to see it kept. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "I think that's the most important thing you've told me about yourself." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it tells me that you keep promises when there's no one left to hold you to them. That's the only version of integrity that actually means anything." I didn't have a response for that. I just decided she was right.